History often turns on a single decision, but few decisions altered the fate of the world as dramatically as Hitler's choice to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a military campaign. It was the moment Nazi Germany crossed a line from which it could never return. The invasion opened a front so huge, so brutally demanding, that it ultimately destroyed the German war machine and ensured Hitler's downfall. But what if that moment never happened? What if Germany never marched east? What if Hitler paused, held back his ambition, and kept the uneasy pact with Stalin intact? The answer is one of the most chilling alternate paths in history, because without the Eastern Front draining Germany's strength, the world could have looked very different, perhaps unrecognizable. To understand this scenario, you must first understand what the Eastern Front actually did to Germany. From 1941 to 1945, the Nazi regime poured nearly two-thirds of its total military strength into the war against the Soviets. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, endless rivers of oil, steel, ammunition, and manpower were swallowed by the vastness of Russia. Most of Germany's losses occurred there. Most of its elite divisions were destroyed there. Most of the war's turning points, Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, were Eastern Front battles. Without that front, Germany would have been overwhelmingly stronger everywhere else. The war becomes a different animal entirely. So imagine Hitler in 1941. He already controls Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Britain stands alone, battered by the Blitz, but still refusing to surrender. America is not yet in the war. Germany's armies are undefeated on land, and the Soviet Union, remarkably, is still supplying Germany with oil, grain, metals, and fuel. Under the terms of the Nazi-Soviet pact, Hitler historically chose to break this arrangement and destroy the USSR. But what if he didn't? What if he decided that fighting Britain, and perhaps America eventually, was already enough, and that war with Stalin would only complicate things? Immediately, the war shifts dramatically. First, Germany is now free to concentrate its industrial and military power on one enemy, Britain. This alone is terrifying. Without the Eastern Front bleeding resources dry, Germany can build more U-boats, more aircraft, more bombers, and more men for coastal assault forces. The Luftwaffe, instead of being drained in Russia, would be fully focused on breaking British air power. The Battle of Britain might have been fought again, this time with far more German strength behind it. Second, Germany could have secured North Africa and the Middle East. Historically, Rommel's Africa Corps was always undersupplied, underfueled, and treated as a sideshow because the Eastern Front consumed nearly everything. But without Barbarossa, Germany could have flooded North Africa with tanks, aircraft, and logistics. Rommel might have taken Egypt, the Suez Canal might have fallen, and if the Germans pushed into the Middle East, they would have found something Hitler desperately needed: oil. Iraqi oil fields, Iranian oil fields, and Gulf oil reserves could have given Germany what it lacked most. With Middle Eastern oil, the Reich becomes something it never truly was: energy independent. This alone could have prolonged the war for years, but the largest change comes from the strategic freedom Germany gains. With no Eastern Front, Germany could commit fully to strangling Britain into submission. More U-boats could have been built. In 1941 alone, Germany constructed roughly 200 submarines. Without the Russian invasion draining resources, that number could double. A larger submarine fleet, combined with control of the Mediterranean, could have brought Britain to the edge of starvation. German submarines historically came close, very close, to cutting Britain off from supplies. Without the enormous industrial diversion of Barbarossa, they might have succeeded entirely. Britain would have been forced into a desperate situation. America might still intervene, but entering a European war where Germany is undefeated, unexhausted, and overflowing with manpower makes the fight far harder, Instead of facing a Germany stretched across 2 continents, America would be facing one that is at its peak strength. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union remains neutral. Stalin historically trusted Hitler far too long, believing that the German leader would not attack until Britain was defeated. In this alternate world, Stalin might continue supplying Germany with iron ore, grain, and especially oil. The Soviet Union becomes an economic partner to a country that is waging war against the West. Stalin would have used the time to rearm quietly, build more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery, more officers, aware that the peace was temporary, but he would still assume that Germany needed him. In this world, Hitler might turn his attention south instead of east, securing the Balkans more tightly, pushing into Turkey, cutting Britain out of the Mediterranean entirely. There is even a plausible path where Germany tries to invade Iceland or Greenland to threaten shipping lanes. Every option becomes more possible without the colossal drain of fighting Russia. And yet the biggest change comes from a single man, Hitler himself. He invaded the Soviet Union because he believed it was his destiny, because he believed communism was a threat that needed to be destroyed, because he believed the Slavic populations were inferior and that Germany needed Lebensraum, living space. Without Barbarossa, Hitler's ideology becomes bottled up. He would have to restrain the very thing that drove him. That's the irony of this alternate timeline. Germany becomes far more dangerous militarily, but Hitler becomes less true to his own fanaticism. But stay with the scenario. If Germany never invades the Soviet Union, the war in Europe becomes a long, grinding stalemate. Britain can resist, America can join, but neither can win quickly. And Hitler, with his armies intact, can reposition, reorganize, and fortify the continent into a fortress. By 1943, the entire map of Europe might look different. Germany still controls France, the Low Countries, and much of the Balkans. Britain remains under constant bombardment and naval blockade. The U-boat threat is stronger, the Luftwaffe is stronger, the Wehrmacht remains unbroken, and the Soviet Union stands to the east, suspicious but neutral. The Allies face a nightmare, a Europe that is united under a Nazi banner, fortified, and nowhere near collapse. And without Soviet troops absorbing 80% of Germany's fury, American soldiers would eventually face that storm head-on. D-Day would become almost impossible. Germany would have far more divisions in France, far more tanks, far more aircraft ready to strike the Allied landing force. The invasion might fail, and if D-Day fails, the war changes permanently. Then there is the darkest possibility of all. With time, resources, and no Eastern Front, Germany could have developed advanced weapons far earlier. The jet aircraft Hitler deployed late in the war might have arrived in 1943 instead of 1945. V-2 rockets could have appeared in massive numbers. Early guided missiles, better submarines, and new tank designs would have been produced in huge quantities instead of prototypes. Even the atomic race might have shifted. Germany had brilliant scientists, but it lacked the resources and stability to pursue the bomb seriously. Without Barbarossa draining the nation, Germany might have aggressively pursued nuclear research. A Nazi Germany with the atomic bomb is one of the most dangerous hypothetical scenarios in human history. But let's explore another angle: Stalin. While Germany strengthens itself fighting the West, Stalin is preparing quietly in the East. The Soviets never trust Germany fully. Knowing Hitler's ideology, Stalin would continue rearming, expanding his armies, and planning for an eventual conflict. The longer Germany and the West fight each other, the more the Soviet Union builds. By 1943 or 1944, the Soviet army becomes enormous again. Stalin might eventually make the first move. He might invade Eastern Europe preemptively, striking at Germany while it's tied up in the West. In this alternate timeline, Barbarossa might happen in reverse, with the Soviets attacking a Germany that never attacked them. The world could end up with a three-way war, Britain and America attacking from the west, Germany fighting them off, and the Soviet Union striking from the East. Europe would become the battleground for the most catastrophic conflict imaginable. The war could last far longer, perhaps into the 1950s, and the map of post-war Europe might be divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union instead of Western democracies. But there is another version of this alternate world, one even more unsettling, one where Britain eventually seeks a negotiated peace. After years of blockade, U-boat attacks and bombing, Britain might decide that continuing the war is hopeless. With no Soviet distraction, Germany could apply enormous pressure on the British Empire. If Britain ever sued for peace, even a limited one, Germany might win the war in Europe completely. Hitler would not need to invade. He would simply control the continent through power, resources, and fear. This outcome leads to a Nazi-dominated Europe stretching from France to the borders of Russia. The Holocaust continues unchecked. Nazi ideology shapes an entire continent. Censorship, forced labor, and racial hierarchy become permanent structures. And America faces a world where democracy in Europe has collapsed entirely. In the Pacific, Japan still attacks Pearl Harbor, but now the United States must fight two enormous enemies with no allies on the European continent. The war becomes global, in a way even worse than the real timeline. America can defeat Japan, but defeating a united, unexhausted Nazi Europe becomes a nightmare scenario. And the Soviet Union, boxed in by a Nazi empire to the west and a strengthened Japan to the east, becomes isolated and endangered. Stalin might be forced into desperate decisions, including his own expansion into the Middle East or Central Europe. The Cold War might erupt between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, with America watching from across the ocean, unable to shape the outcome. The terrifying truth is simple. Germany not invading the Soviet Union makes the world far more unstable, far more dangerous, and far more susceptible to a long-term Nazi victory. The Eastern Front, with all its brutality, prevented that world from existing. Barbarossa destroyed the Wehrmacht, drained Germany's strength, and shifted the balance of power permanently. Without it, the Allies would have faced a Germany at full strength. Britain might have fallen, D-Day might have failed, the Holocaust might have continued until Europe was reshaped entirely, and the map of the world would look nothing like it does today. Hitler's biggest mistake was the one thing that prevented his vision from becoming reality. If he had never invaded the Soviet Union, he might have won the war.